Now I have everything I need. Here's the complete new story. My grandson pressed something into my palm as he hugged me goodbye at the front door. He held on a second longer than usual, tighter than usual, and then he was gone, jogging back down the driveway to where his stepmother's car idled at the curb. I stood there watching the taillights disappear around the corner before I looked down at what he'd given me. A folded piece of paper, small enough to hide in a closed fist. I waited until I was back inside, door locked behind me, before I opened it. "Grandpa," it said, in my grandson Noah's careful handwriting, "look up Diane before she was married. Her last name used to be Crestwood. Then go to Dad's home office. The lockbox, in the second drawer of the filing cabinet. The code is Mom's birthday month and year only. 4 digits. You need to see what's in there before next Thursday. Please don't tell her I told you. Please hurry." I read it twice. Then I sat down in my armchair and read it a third time. My name is Walter, and I am 65 years old. I live in a brick ranch house on the outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee, surrounded by the woodworking tools I never seem to have enough time to use, and the garden my wife, Eleanor, planted 22 years ago, and that I've kept alive out of sheer stubbornness ever since she passed. Eleanor died of a stroke 18 months ago. It happened fast. One morning she was asking me if I wanted scrambled eggs or fried, and 4 days later she was gone. We had 41 years together. I keep expecting to feel like the worst of the grief is over, and I'm still waiting. Our son Michael took it as hard as I did, maybe harder in some ways. He was 44 years old, an architect with his own firm downtown, and he'd always been close to his mother in that quiet, steady way that means you don't realize how much you lean on something until it isn't there. His first marriage had ended years before Eleanor died. His ex-wife Sandra moved up to Charlotte with their son Noah after the divorce, and they'd been civil about it, the way parents who love their child more than they dislike each other manage to be. Noah was 14 now, splitting his time between Charlotte and Knoxville, and he was the kind of kid who made you think the world was going to be all right. 8 months after Eleanor died, Michael met Diane at a commercial real estate conference in Atlanta. She was 36, tall, dark-haired, with a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. Michael called me on a Sunday afternoon to tell me about her, and I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Something lighter. I was glad for him. I thought, this is what Eleanor would have wanted. She always worried about Michael being alone. They dated for 5 months, got married on a Saturday, in early spring, at a small ceremony in the Smoky Mountains. I gave a toast. Noah stood up next to his father as best man and tried very hard not to cry, and mostly succeeded. It was a good day. For a while after that, things were genuinely good. Diane cooked Sunday dinners and invited me over without being asked. She asked about Eleanor with what seemed like real curiosity, looked at the photos on Michael's walls, said she wished she could have known her. She called me Walt, which nobody but Eleanor had ever called me, and instead of bothering me, it made me feel strangely welcomed. I told myself I'd gotten lucky, that my son had found someone worth finding. It was around the 6-month mark when I started to notice something was off. Michael had always been the kind of man who never sat still. He ran in the mornings, kept a standing desk at work, had more energy at 44 than most men half his age. So when he started seeming tired at Sunday dinners, I chalked it up to the pressures of running his own business. When his hands started shaking slightly, I thought maybe he was drinking too much coffee. When he forgot the name of a colleague he'd worked with for 8 years, right in the middle of telling me a story, and then laughed it off and changed the subject, I told myself everybody had days like that. But then came the evening. Michael called me from outside a grocery store because he couldn't remember how to get home. He lived 4 miles from that grocery store. He'd driven that route 10,000 times. I drove over and found him sitting in his car in the parking lot, looking pale and embarrassed and a little frightened. I followed him home. Diane met us at the door with her hand already on Michael's arm before I'd even said hello, and she guided him inside with that particular kind of attention that could have been tenderness or could have been something else. His doctor ran tests, blood work, an EKG, a neurological assessment. The results came back inconclusive. His heart showed some irregularity that the cardiologist wanted to monitor. There was talk of possible early onset something or other, never quite named, never quite confirmed. A specialist appointment was scheduled. In the meantime, Diane managed his medications, kept a notebook of his symptoms to share with the doctors, spoke to the nurses herself when she took him to appointments because Michael got confused and lost track of what he was trying to say. I sat with all of this, and I told myself it was illness. I told myself these things happen. I told myself Diane was doing everything right. Noah saw something I didn't. I only understood that later. The night he pressed that note into my hand was Thanksgiving. Diane had cooked a beautiful meal. The table looked like something out of a magazine. Michael ate slowly, his movements careful and deliberate the way a man moves when he doesn't entirely trust his own body. He smiled when he was supposed to smile and laughed in the right places, but his eyes were distant in a way that made my chest ache. Diane refilled his water glass twice, without being asked, and suggested he take his evening pills a little early because of the long day. I watched Noah watching his father all through dinner. The boy was quiet in the way children get quiet when they're frightened and trying not to show it. He answered when spoken to, cleared plates without being asked. And twice, I caught him studying Diane the way you'd study someone you were trying to figure out, trying to find the seam where the real thing ended and the performance began. When I got home that night and sat down with his note, the first thing I felt was the particular cold that comes not from temperature but from recognition. The cold of something you already knew pressing up through the surface where you'd buried it. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I typed in Diane Crestwood, then Diane Crestwood, Tennessee, then Diane Crestwood fraud. It took me 20 minutes to find it, and when I did, I had to read it 3 times before my brain would accept what my eyes were seeing. Diane Crestwood had been charged in 2017 with financial fraud in the state of Georgia. She'd been married to a man named Gerald Harmon, a retired physician in Savannah. Gerald Harmon had died 18 months into their marriage from what was ruled cardiac arrhythmia. He was 61. After his death, his adult children from his first marriage had contested his estate, claiming the will that left everything to Diane had been signed during a period when Gerald was cognitively impaired. The case had eventually been settled out of court. No criminal conviction. Diane had walked away with a negotiated settlement and a different last name by the time Michael met her. I sat with that for a long time. Then I drove to Michael and Diane's house. Diane's car wasn't in the driveway. Michael answered the door in his bathrobe, moving slowly. He seemed genuinely happy to see me, which made what I was about to do feel both easier and harder at the same time. I told him I'd left my reading glasses somewhere in the house last night. He waved me in without thinking twice. I spent 15 minutes looking in the living room and the kitchen while Michael made us both tea. And then I said, "You know what? Let me check your office." I was in there before dinner for a minute. Michael called out that he didn't know why I'd been in there, but go ahead. The filing cabinet was oak, 4 drawers, pushed against the wall beneath the window. The second drawer stuck a little when I pulled it. Inside were hanging folders, neatly labeled, and pushed to the back was a gray metal lockbox about the size of a hardcover book. It had a 4-digit combination lock. I entered 0784, Eleanor's birthday. July 1984. It opened. Inside was a small spiral notebook, a folded document, 2 amber pill bottles with the labels removed, and a photograph. I took pictures of everything with my phone before I touched a single thing. The notebook had Diane's handwriting. I recognized it from the grocery lists she left on the kitchen counter. The entries were dated, going back roughly 5 months, and they were clinical in a way that felt like a stone dropping through water. Increased confusion per plan. Episode at parking lot success. Called Walt. Cardiologist concerned about arrhythmia good. Specialist appointment scheduled for 12/4. Need to accelerate before that appointment. Heart scenario still optimal cover. I set the notebook down. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because inside I was nothing close to steady. The folded document was Michael's will. I found the date first. It had been drawn up 7 weeks ago, after Michael's symptoms had already begun. Everything went to Diane. The house, his firm, his investment accounts, the life insurance policy. There was a small bequest to Noah, a token amount, and a note in the margin in Diane's handwriting that said, "Double check beneficiary designation on 401k. The signature at the bottom looked like Michael's. But I had 44 years of my son's signature in my memory, and the loop on the M was wrong. Michael always made it higher, more angular. This one was rounder, softer. The signature of someone trying to copy a signature they'd studied but hadn't grown up with. The pill bottles had no labels. I took pictures of the pills themselves, small, white, oval-shaped. I took pictures of everything, the document, every page of the notebook, both pill bottles and the photograph, which I hadn't looked at yet. The photograph stopped my breath. It was a picture of my house, taken from the street, at night. The lights were on inside. My silhouette was visible in the kitchen window. On the back of the photograph, in Diane's handwriting, Walt $800K policy. Beneficiary is Michael. After Michael, unknown. Confirm. She was already thinking about me. She hadn't finished with my son yet, and she was already thinking about me. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, locked the box, pushed it to the back of the drawer. I walked out of the office and found Michael in the kitchen, still in his robe, both cups of tea sitting untouched on the counter. I found them, I said, holding up my reading glasses case, which I had never actually lost. Michael smiled. Want to stay for breakfast? I can't today, I said, but I'll see you Sunday. I drove home and I called my old friend, Ray Kowalski. Ray and I had met in the Army 40 years ago, and when he came back home, he'd joined the Knoxville Police Department and worked there for 27 years before he retired. He was the kind of man who listened without interrupting, who asked exactly the questions that needed asking, and who didn't treat you like you were being dramatic when you told him something serious. I told him everything. The note from Noah, what I'd found about Diane Crestwood, the Georgia case, the photograph of my house. He was quiet for a moment when I finished. Walt, he said, the pills. We need to know what those pills are, because if she's doing what it looks like she's doing, we need to catch her with the actual substance in her possession, and we need evidence of her administering it. Photos of a notebook aren't going to be enough on their own for a judge. I know. You also need to move your son out of that house before Thursday. I know that too. He outlined a plan. It required me to call Michael's cardiologist and his primary care physician, both. It required some cooperation from Ray's former colleagues, who were still on the force. It required me to be patient for 2 more days, and patience has never come easily to me when the people I love are in danger. But I understood why it was necessary. That night, I called Noah. He answered on the second ring, his voice carefully neutral in the way a teenager sounds when they're not sure who might be listening. I told him I'd seen the note. I told him I'd done exactly what he asked. I told him his father was going to be all right. There was a long pause, and then he said, quietly, I've been watching her put something in his tea every morning. He doesn't notice. He thinks it's honey. How long? Since September. Maybe longer. I didn't know what to do. I was scared nobody would believe me. I believe you, I said. You did the right thing. You did everything exactly right. He was quiet again. Then, Grandpa, she looks at him sometimes when he's not watching. The way she looks at him, it's like he's not even a person to her. I know, son. I know. I need you to stay away from whatever she makes, I told him. Don't eat or drink anything she prepares until this is over. Restaurants, vending machines, food you buy yourself. Can you do that? I've already been doing that for 2 months. 14 years old, and carrying this alone for 2 months. The thought of it made me furious in the quiet, cold way that is worse than being loud about it. Wednesday morning, I called Michael's cardiologist directly. I said I had information relevant to his patient's care and I needed 15 minutes. The cardiologist, a careful, precise woman named Dr. Vasquez, listened to me describe the pills I'd photographed and the entries in the notebook, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then said she wanted to run a specific blood panel on Michael before his Thursday appointment. She said she would arrange it herself that morning, and that I should make sure Michael came in. I called Michael and told him I was taking him out for breakfast, and then to his cardiologist for a follow-up. He didn't ask why. He just said, let me get dressed. Diane was at a real estate showing when I picked him up. I made sure of that. Dr. Vasquez had the results by Thursday morning. Digoxin. Michael's blood showed elevated levels of digoxin, a heart medication that in therapeutic doses controls certain cardiac conditions, but in the doses showing up in his blood work would cause precisely the symptoms he'd been experiencing for 5 months. Confusion, arrhythmia, fatigue, cognitive impairment, loss of coordination. With continued dosing, it could cause cardiac arrest. He'd been healthy when he married Diane. His heart had been fine. She had been poisoning him with a medication that mimicked a condition he didn't have, in a way that would eventually look like his heart had simply given out. Ray's contacts at KPD moved quickly after that. The blood panel was exactly the kind of concrete evidence they needed for a warrant. On Thursday morning, 2 detectives and a forensic pharmacologist arrived at Michael and Diane's house at 7:45 a.m. I was already inside. I'd arrived at 6, telling Diane I wanted to take Michael to his appointment myself, that I felt better being involved. She hadn't wanted to let me in, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of whether refusing me would raise more suspicion than letting me through the door. She let me in. She made coffee. She asked if I wanted a cup, and I said yes, and then poured it down the sink while she was in the other room. When the doorbell rang and Diane went to answer it, I was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her. I saw the moment she understood what was happening. Her face went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and then, underneath those, something else. Something controlled, calculated. She didn't panic. She just became very still. Detective Patricia Nguyen showed her the warrant. Diane asked if she needed to call her lawyer, and Detective Nguyen said she was welcome to, and Diane excused herself to make a call, and the uniformed officer standing near the door made sure she didn't go anywhere that wasn't visible. They found the pills in the lockbox. Digoxin, later confirmed at twice the standard therapeutic dose. They found 3 more bottles in a zippered pouch inside a winter coat in the back of the master bedroom closet. They found the notebook with the dosing records. They found the forged will and, on Diane's personal laptop, a draft of a second document, a healthcare proxy, that would have given her sole authority over Michael's medical decisions. They found the photograph of my house in her bag. They found an internet search history that included my full name, my address, the name of my life insurance company, and the title of the policy I'd taken out years ago. They arrested Diane Harmon Mitchell. That was her full legal name. I learned on Thursday morning at 8:12 a.m. Michael was sitting in the living room when it happened, still in the early stages of understanding what he was being told. I sat next to him on the couch, and I kept my hand on his shoulder while the detectives explained what the blood tests had found, what the notebook documented, what the warrant had uncovered. At some point, in the middle of all of it, Michael turned to look at me, and the expression on his face was the same one he'd had at 7 years old, when he was first learning that the world contained things that couldn't be explained away or made sense of. I didn't have anything to say that would have been adequate, so I just put my arm around him the way I had when he was 7, and he let me, which I was grateful for. Noah flew in from Charlotte 3 days later, as soon as his mother could get him on a plane. He walked through my front door and straight into Michael's arms, and I stepped into the kitchen and found something very important to look at, out the window, for a few minutes. The medical team took Michael off the digoxin and monitored him carefully for 2 weeks. The cognitive symptoms began clearing within days. His hands stopped shaking. His words came back, first the speed of them, the precision, the way he could find the right word without pausing to search for it. His memory came back in pieces, like static clearing from a signal. By the end of the 2nd week, he was himself again, or the version of himself that would be himself going forward, which was not entirely the same thing as before, but was recognizably him. I drove him to his house once, about a month later, to collect the last of the things he wanted to keep. He stood in the middle of the living room for a long moment, looking at the table where we'd had Thanksgiving dinner, the window where the light came in at a certain angle in the morning that he'd always liked. Then he nodded once and started carrying boxes to the car, and I helped him, and we didn't say much, and that was the right way to handle it. He bought a townhouse about 2 miles from mine, close enough that Noah, when he decided to transfer to a school in Knoxville for his junior year, could walk between them. They painted it themselves over a long weekend that involved significant amounts of bad pizza and an argument about the right shade of white for the hallway that I personally found very encouraging as a sign that normal life was resuming. The trial was 8 months later. The prosecution had built a thorough case. The blood panels, the digoxin bottles with Diane's fingerprints, the notebook with its dated entries, the search history documenting her interest in my finances and my insurance policy, the forensic document examiner who testified that the will had been forged, the signature a close but imperfect reproduction of Michael's. Ray's former colleagues had also dug into the Georgia case, and this time, with a criminal case in progress, Gerald Harmon's family cooperated fully. His medical records were subpoenaed. Tissue samples from his archived pathology slides were retested. The cause of death was reclassified. Diane had done this before. Diane had done this before and gotten away with it, and she had come to Knoxville and found a grieving man with money and a trusting father and a teenage son she'd gambled wasn't paying attention. She'd gambled wrong. The jury took 9 hours to return a verdict. Guilty on all counts, 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of murder in the first degree for Gerald Harmon, fraud, forgery, and several additional charges that I've forgotten the exact names of because by that point I was having trouble keeping track of them all. The judge, a 60-year-old man with the flat, careful voice of someone who's spent decades making sure his words mean exactly what he intends, gave her 35 years to life. He said, in the sentencing, that what made this case particularly egregious was the methodical patience of it. The way it had been planned, the way 2 men had been targeted not in a moment of rage or desperation, but through a sustained, calculated campaign that used the language of care and love as its primary weapon. I thought about that for a long time afterwards. The language of care, because that was the part that was hardest to untangle, even after everything. Diane had been kind to me. She had been warm and engaged, and had made me feel, in those early months, that Michael had married someone who would look after him, someone who understood what we had lost when Eleanor died. None of that had been real, but I had felt it as real, and you can't unfeel something just because you later learn it was a performance. You just have to file it in the right folder and keep moving. Noah is 15 now. He started asking questions after the trial, not the what happened questions, those he already knew, but the why questions, the how does someone become that questions. I didn't have good answers. I told him that I thought there were people in the world who saw other people primarily as problems to be solved or resources to be used, and that one of the skills worth developing as you moved through life was learning to tell the difference between someone who was interested in you as a person and someone who was interested in you as a means to an end. I told him it wasn't always obvious. I told him the fact that it wasn't always obvious wasn't his fault or anyone else's fault. I told him the most important thing he'd done was pay attention and then, when he was certain enough, trust the right person with what he'd found. He thought about that for a while. Then he said, I was scared you wouldn't believe me. I told him that was the part that would stay with me the longest. Not the forgery or the poison or the photograph of my house in the dark. The image of my 14-year-old grandson sitting across from a woman who was killing his father, carrying that knowledge alone for 2 months, waiting until he was certain enough of the evidence and certain enough of me before he wrote that note. He'd watched her. He'd followed the patterns, noticed the timing, tracked what happened to his father after certain meals, after the morning tea, after Diane had been alone in the kitchen. He'd done all of that without anyone asking him to, without any adult in his life recognizing that he needed help, because the adults in his life, including me, had been too busy explaining away the things that didn't add up. Children do this. They see things. They're not yet practiced at the particular adult skill of overriding what they observe with what seems socially acceptable to conclude. Noah knew what he'd seen. He didn't know how to prove it, and he didn't know who to tell. But he knew, I'll carry the guilt of those 2 months for a long time. The 2 months when he sat with it alone because he wasn't sure I'd believe him. I should have made it clearer, earlier, that he could bring me anything, that there was no observation too strange, no suspicion too seemingly outlandish, that I wouldn't take seriously when it came from him. I should have noticed sooner that something was wrong with my son. I should have trusted my own instincts earlier, because the instincts were there. I'd had the feeling, the low-level unease, the sense that something wasn't adding up, and I'd overridden it because Diane was pleasant and competent, and because I wanted to believe Michael had found something good. That's what I'd tell anyone who asked me what the lesson was. Not to be suspicious of the people who come into your family. Not to treat every new relationship as a potential threat. But to take your instincts seriously when they speak up. To make sure the young people in your life know they can come to you with the things that don't have easy names yet. To understand that someone can seem kind and still not be safe. That charm is a skill that can be practiced deliberately, and that the people who mean to harm you most often spend the most time making sure you feel comfortable first. Eleanor would have figured it out before I did. I believe that entirely. She had a quality of attention I've always lacked, a way of watching people that was warm on the surface and very precise underneath. She would have seen something in Diane's eyes at Thanksgiving dinner, some small calculation, some moment of slippage, and she would have mentioned it to me quietly on the drive home, and I would have said, "You're reading too much into things," and she would have said, "Maybe," and she would have been right. But Eleanor wasn't here. That's the fact we have to build everything else around. Michael is doing well. The firm had a good year. He's taken on a new junior architect who he speaks about with the kind of enthusiasm that tells me the work is going well. He went on one date, about 3 months ago, with a woman he met through a mutual friend, and when I asked him afterward how it went, he said she was very nice, and he'd had a good time, and he wasn't sure he was ready yet. And I told him there was no timer running. He smiled in a way that looked like Eleanor, and the familiarity of it caught me off guard, the way it still does, all these months later. Sundays we have dinner, Michael, Noah, and me, rotating whose house we cook at. Noah is learning to make biscuits from scratch, and is at the stage where he's convinced he's almost figured it out, which means he's about 4 attempts away from actually figuring it out. Michael grills in the summer and experiments with soups in the winter with mixed but earnest results. I make Eleanor's chili, the one she made every October for 40 years, because some recipes are too important to let go. We talk about her a lot. That surprised me. In the early months after everything happened, I thought the trauma of what had occurred would make those conversations harder, would tangle up the grief with everything else, and make it difficult to access the uncomplicated love underneath. But it turned out the opposite was true. Going through something terrible together had stripped away a lot of the formality that had built up over years of living separately. The politeness of family members who see each other at holidays but don't really show up in each other's daily lives. We'd showed up for each other when it counted. That changed things. I'm 65 years old. I live alone in the house Eleanor planted the garden in. And I keep the garden going because she would want me to, and because there's something honest about putting your hands in soil and growing something that needed tending. I work on woodworking projects in the garage. I have dinner with my son and my grandson every Sunday. I take long walks in the mornings through the neighborhood, and occasionally I notice I am paying more attention than I used to patterns, to details, to the small things that don't add up, and I'm not sure whether that's wisdom or damage. But I've decided it can be both. Noah asked me once whether I was angry. Not about Diane specifically, but in general. Whether surviving something like this leaves you angry at the world, suspicious of people, closed off from anything new. I told him the truth. I told him I'd spent some time being angry and some time being very frightened, and that I'd worked through most of both, though not all. I told him that the opposite of being naive wasn't being closed off. It was paying attention. It was holding 2 things at once. The genuine desire to believe the best about people, alongside the willingness to look clearly when something doesn't feel right. He nodded. He's a serious kid. He processes things carefully and doesn't perform, understanding he doesn't actually feel, which is a quality that will serve him well in life, and occasionally makes conversations with him feel a little like being on trial, in the best possible way. Last week, he called me on a Tuesday for no particular reason, which is unusual, because 14-year-olds don't generally call their grandfathers on a Tuesday without a reason. He said he'd been thinking about something. He said he'd read about the Georgia case, the earlier one, Gerald Harmon, and that what bothered him most wasn't that it had happened, but that it had been looked at, and explained away as an accident. I know, I said. He said, if I hadn't seen her put something in his tea that first time, I might have explained it away too. I might have told myself I was imagining things. You didn't, though, I said. No, he said. I didn't. There was a pause. And then he said, I think about that sometimes, what it means to not explain things away. I think about that too, I told him. That's the real inheritance, I've decided. Not the house or the insurance policy or anything else Diane was trying to get her hands on. It's this. What gets passed down when you sit across from someone you love and tell them the truth about hard things? What Noah learned watching his father fight his way back to himself. What Michael learned about trusting the people who show up when it counts. What I learned about paying attention and taking seriously the things a 14-year-old boy pressed into my palm on his way out the door. I still check the garden every morning. Eleanor's roses are coming back this spring, the yellow ones she planted along the back fence, and I've been watching the first green pushing up through the soil with a feeling I can't entirely name, something between grief and relief and straightforward ordinary gratitude for things that come back, for things that survive. We almost lost Michael. We came very close. One more week, Dr. Vasquez told me afterward. One more week of the doses he was receiving, and the heart damage would likely have been irreversible, and the next episode could have looked, to anyone not looking closely, exactly like what Diane had been engineering it to look like. One more week. But Noah was paying attention. And Noah, when he was certain enough, and scared enough, and brave enough, found a way to tell me, and I listened. That's all it was, in the end. A boy who paid attention, a grandfather who listened, and the 2 months between those things that I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I could give back to him. But we're here. Michael is here. Noah is growing up the way he should be growing up, opinionated about biscuit recipes and thinking hard about what it means not to explain things away. And Sunday dinner is in 3 days, and I'm making the chili, and I have every intention of being there. That's enough. That's more than enough.